Hi, my name is Gloria Ostas. Today is Monday, January the 31st, 1994. I am at the Canadian Macedonian Place Historical Library with Peter Kondoff. I will be interviewing him today for the Archival Library. Peter, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Peter, would you like to tell us, please, where you were born?
I was born in Detroit, Michigan in October the 23rd, 1925. I'm one of three boys, the oldest of three boys. My mother was from the village of Gabarish. My father was from the village of Dumbany in Greece. My dad came to this country in 1909 as an illegal immigrant, and my mom came as one of the mail order brides in 1925.
Are your parents from Northern Macedonia or Southern Macedonia? Macedonia and Greece.
Both my father and mother are from what is called coastal Macedonia, which is the northern part of Greece. My mother is from the village of Gabarish, and my father is from the village of Dumbany. My grandparents were also from this part of Macedonia, but beyond that, I don't really know that much.
Can you tell us how your father immigrated illegally?
My father, when he came to this country, came with two other Macedonian boys. You got to really picture this. He came in 1909 when he was 14 years old. That's all of them were, 14 years old. Now, can you imagine three 14-year-olds who couldn't speak the language, who came clear across the Atlantic Ocean? They landed somewhere in New York City where they were told they couldn't enter into the United States. And the boat at that time, there were many refugees. The boat just simply went further up the coast to New Jersey and let them off. Now these three boys left the boat and had to find their way from New York or New Jersey, wherever they were, and end up in St. Louis, Missouri. That's almost 1,000 miles away. Now, I don't know how much money they had. I knew they couldn't speak English. How they got there, how they made their money, how they communicated, this to me is amazing.
Why did they come? What pressures were at home that led them to come?
Well, like many Macedonians, especially in 1909, living conditions probably were very hard in the village where they were at, and all of them heard about this new country, this new land, where you can go and make money and send money back. And the expression that we hear is gachabari, or people that they sent their fathers, they send mothers, they send their sons to the country, in this case it was the United States, to make money and send money back to help support the family.
And was this what your father did?
And that's what he was doing, yes.
Did he eventually bring over his parents as well?
No, I never got to see my grandparents. They died there. There were quite a few in the family. I remember some of my uncles that came over from Macedonia later on when I was a small child. And I also remember that they somehow or other were illegally in the country, and they were eventually caught, and they were deported. One of them went to live in Australia, and the family grew, and it's quite famous in Australia, especially as Macedonian immigrants.
Do you recall what associations or that your father was a part of when he was a new immigrant? Macedonian associations, or what church he was affiliated with? Or?
I think before I talk about what associations they were in, I think it should be understood that in Detroit, in particular, among the Macedonian community, there were really only two groups. One group was considered the left-wing Marxist group, more socialist in their philosophy. and the other group was associated with a church. But the church was predominantly controlled by an organization called the MPO, or the Macedonian People's Organization. And if you didn't agree with their philosophy, or if you didn't agree with what they liked, you just simply didn't belong to their part or their world. But the amazing thing about Detroit itself was while there was this division that did exist, still we knew each other and we were able to meet at functions, and there was no real animosity. If there was any animosity that existed, the worst I ever got was I would hear my mother, who was an outspoken Macedonian, would speak with another chap who was an outspoken MPO his name was Kondoff, and they used to argue like mad, but they would argue and they'd still be friends.
Growing up, did you have a strong Macedonian identity in America?
I don't think I honestly knew what my identity was until we had a history class, and that must have been probably in a grade 9. And for the first time, my history teacher was talking about Alexander the Great and the Macedonians. And then all of a sudden, bells started ringing around, and I said, hey, I'm a Macedonian. And I started to remember a little bit about my identity. Now, how that was instilled in me, I don't know, but I always was led to believe that I was a Macedonian, not anything else. Incidentally, that was the highest mark I ever got, was in history.
So tell me about your education.
Well, I went through a Cass Technical High School in Detroit, which is considered one of the best schools in Michigan. After finishing Cass Tech, this was in 1943, I enlisted in the United States Army Air Force, and went in for training. As a cadet, I went to the University of Tennessee and went through for the cadet training for the Air Force. I never finished as a pilot, but I did finish as an aerial gunner. And in 1946, I was discharged, and I went to Wayne State University. At that time, I became active politically. And when I say politically, I mean it in the sense that I was a very strong believer in the American Constitution and what it stood for. And while I was in the Army, I saw many things that were contradictory. And while at the university, I saw many things that were contradictory. And this sort of went against the grain, to talk about democracy and yet see that it just didn't exist.
How old were you when you finished university?
I never finished university. As an activist, I finished about 3 years at Wayne State. And I got married in 1949. My wife was a girl from Toronto. About 1 month after we were married, my wife was barred from the United States. So I was put in a position of living in Detroit. And my wife had to stay in Windsor, and we couldn't see each other except by crossing the border, and I was the only one that could cross the border. So eventually what I did is we sold everything that we had in Detroit, and we went to live in Windsor.
And what was your life in the beginning like with your wife here in Toronto? Tell us about how it began.
Well, before I talk about Toronto, really, I should say that we lived 5 years in Windsor. I was working in Detroit and commuting back and forth while we lived in Windsor. Eventually, I was offered a position to become a chief engineer of a company here in Toronto, and I took that opportunity to come here. It was more of not only an opportunity to get to Toronto, but also to get involved in education, which I was interested in at the time as well. As a result of this, I continued my education and became a professional engineer. And I spent a good portion of 15 years in engineering when economically it was not feasible to continue. So what I did then was I looked at my possibilities, and my makeup was such that I did not want to go into senior management because I saw too many senior managers that became married to the corporation, and I could not be a yes man to that extent. And it was suggested I go into teaching, and I went into teaching. And for the last 25 years, that's where I was.
Can you tell me a little bit about your church? What church you go to?
The church. Before I talk about the church, I think it's interesting to note how I get involved in a church. I am not a religious person in the sense that I would go to church and light a candle, but I am a religious person to the extent that I believe that each and every individual has a right to profess their own identity. And in this respect, I was able to play a rather important part in the starting of the Church St. Clement's. But before the church started, after we had established ourselves here in Toronto, my father-in-law, who was very active with the Macedonian community, asked me to get involved. And up to that point, because of the problems that we had with my wife's exclusion from the United States, we were very careful to avoid anything that was that even had the semblance of political implications. On the other hand, the whole issue relative to the Macedonians, I felt at that time was not a political issue, but one of more of a moral issue. And I did get involved. I got involved in 1960, 1 year after the formation of what was then the United Macedonian Committee, and later on became the United Macedonians. And almost immediately, I was elected as the executive secretary, and for the next 10 years, that's all I ever did. While as executive secretary of the United Macedonians, it was important. I did quite a bit of work there, and one of the things that I'm rather proud of is I had a lot to do with setting up the Constitution, the way the organization was run. Initially, I became the organizer, and I tried to promote the faith, if you will, against the enemy, and the enemy at that time to us was the MPO. So I went to Detroit to talk to others about setting up chapters in Detroit, to Windsor, to Gary, Indiana, to Rochester, New York. And eventually the concept grew until in 1970 we had a national convention, which I was proud to be the chairman of, and we had many dignitaries from all over the world at that time. And at that time, the United Macedonians tried to establish itself as not just as a local organization, but as an international organization. Now, I'm mentioning the United Macedonians only relative to your question, because they are both tied together. The United Macedonians was formed in 1959, but from 1959 on, it was obvious, especially to me and to others such as Spiro Basil, who was active, my father-in-law, Chris Vasiliev, and There were others. Paul Meroff was involved, and Jim Saunders, who was president, just to name a few, and I'd be leaving out many other names that were involved. But to me, it was very important to understand, or to let others understand, that one of the biggest obstacles that I felt to the Macedonian community was the fact that you were either a follower of the MPO, or you were a non-Macedonian, you were a non-entity. And there were so many of these non-entities that felt left out. And it was a shame that they should be left out. Well, with the Second World War and the recognition of the Republic of Macedonia as part of the Federation of Yugoslavia, the Macedonian Church declared its autonomy in Macedonia at that time. And it became ripe that we should look at the possibilities of having a truly Macedonian church, not one that was subservient to the Bulgarian Synod, but one that was Macedonian. And that's how we got involved into looking at the possibilities of starting a church.
Peter, could you explain for us how the church was started?
The church, we hear quite a bit said today that the church was started by the United Macedonians. And although the United Macedonians, we as the United Macedonians, played a very influential part in starting the church, it cannot honestly be said that the United Macedonians started the church, because it involved everybody. The United Macedonians, we as a committee, felt the need for communicating with Macedonia and saying, what can be done? Can you send somebody over relative to the church? And we had an annual picnic, which was the Alien Den picnic. So we invited the priests to come for the Alien Den picnic. And inviting them to come over, was rather what turned out to be fortunate later on, but a very unfortunate tragedy took place. That was in 1963, was the earthquake that took place in Skopje. So at the same time we invited these people to have for the Healing Dead picnic, we had the earthquake that took place in Skopje, and that mobilized everybody, all of Macedonians, to try to collect money and send aid to Macedonia. And we were one of our committee, my wife in fact was the secretary in charge of the earthquake committee, was in the process of collecting money, and in the process of collecting this money, it generated a lot of interest among many Macedonians who we didn't know even existed. They didn't go to St. Clements, or sorry, to St. Kittle Methodi. They didn't go to St. George's. They were Macedonians, but they had no place to go. And the only other place that they had to go was the Macedonian People's League had a club on Ontario Street, and they were considered the left wing, and there were others that didn't fit in anywhere. Now with the earthquake, all these people got together, and it was a wonderful opportunity to say, hey, how about having a church over here? And this is how the church really started. The initiation came from a lot of from the United Macedonians, but the fulfillment of that church itself involved many people that weren't members.
Were a lot of the cultural figureheads associated were a lot of the Macedonian society figureheads or cultural figureheads associated with the church? More of them. I know the community was slightly fractured, but were more of them associated with the St. Clement's Church?
I think it's very different. When we talk about cultural, keep in mind we're talking about roughly one generation, maybe 1.5, 2 generations from leaving Macedonia in the northern part of Greece, and most of them were from northern part of Greece. The Macedonians that we had here, very, very few were professionals. Very few were teachers or engineers or what have you. Most of the successful Macedonians were people like Costa Andrews, who had a large restaurant, and there was Mike Town, who had a restaurant someplace else, and Spiro Basil. Most of them were in the restaurant business in Toronto. And that was the highest degree of success that they had at that time. I should mention Primrose Donuts at the same time. And there were others, Nob Hill Farms, but Steve Stavro Nob Hill Farms was very closely allied with with the church that existed, St. Kirill Methodi. So the people that were primarily involved in it were the few businessmen that we had. I was one of the few at that time that was considered a professional. There weren't that many professionals around at that time.
And you said, what was the year that the church was started?
The church itself was started, it was initiated in 1962. It was actually started in the initial formal process was 1963.
Okay, how did the politics of the old country, how were the politics of old country, how could you compare them to the politics in Canada?
The politics in the old country is difficult for me to relate to, because it has to go through various stages. If we start talking about the politics of the old country before 1912, before the Greeks were there, then the politics would have been largely one of Macedonians existing under the Ottoman Empire. The politics after 1912, 1913 would have been the politics of Macedonians that lived there, existing under the Greek occupation, or Bulgarian occupation, or Serbian occupation, depending on what part of Macedonia you come from. But as far as the Macedonians themselves were concerned, they had no specific politics other than what we got out of our leaders from the revolution in 1903, the Ilinden uprising, what have you. Following that, many of the young people that would have been our leaders had disappeared. They died. And the remnants of that were people like my father, who was only 14 years old in 1909. So that there was no real leadership. So for a long period of time, for over a generation, there was nobody to really give the Macedonian the leadership it needed. Now, as far as the politics of the Macedonians here in Canada and in the United States, the Macedonian People's Organization took a very strong position, or Macedonian Patriotic Organization, and although they did try to identify themselves as a non-political organization, they were very political, and they took some very strong political stands. On the other hand, the opponents were considered to be the socialists, or the ones that advocated socialism or communism. But if we actually looked at the individuals that were involved, there were very, very few among the socialists or communists that really knew what it was all about, and very few even among the MPOs that really knew exactly what the position of the party was.
Now, the relationship of Macedonians to the church, was it a relationship of dependence because they were, I'm talking about new immigrants and what you saw at the time that the church was founded?
Dependent is what way?
Like, dependent, like, was it a place to become attached to what you had left behind? Because
Social dependence, possibly, yes.
Yeah.
It was their tie, and I think the important thing here is when we talk about dependence, the Macedonian church is quite a bit different from many of the other churches in that it's not just a religious center, but it's also a social center. It's a place where people get together to find out what's happening in their families, what's happening in Macedonia, what's happening in Europe, and to maintain the ties that were gradually being diminished or being lost without the church. So now with the Macedonian church coming over here, they were able to establish many of these ties, and with these ties they were able to establish and develop much of the culture that was gradually being lost, and that was their dances, their costumes, and their history and what have you. So through the church, many of this was coming back, and the church did give us the chance to maintain, to try to remember what these pasts were, and to instill these institutions among the younger people.
Did the church provide social services for new immigrants? Was that a part of the, was that one of the goals of the church, to help immigrants assimilate into the new country?
If we talk about the church, the Macedonian church itself, and I was on the executive of more than four executives that were there. I know, and I also know that the other executives, one of their prime directives was to get the young people involved, and they would hold dances, and also they held Sunday school classes, and the Sunday school classes were trying to bring the Macedonian culture, the language, and to get our young people to understand what it was all about. So there was quite a bit of an effort there to instill the culture.
In your home life, did you have, while you were young, did you look upon traditional roles, traditional Macedonian roles as a child? Your mother and your father, did they play the traditional roles? And if they did, what are the traditional Macedonian roles?
First, I think I'd rather answer the latter question first. The impression that one gets, if we talk about the Europeans, is one of where the traditional family has the dominant male and a subservient female. And this is very true, especially among some of the other nationalities, such as the Greeks and what have you, where the male is the boss and the female has to sit there and be very subservient. This is not true with the Macedonians as much as I can remember. My mother was a dominant member in our family, and she was not the exception. It seemed to exist among many Macedonians, whereas the female played a dominant, if not an equal role in the running of the family. And in spite of the fact many of the women came from Europe, and you would have said they followed the men coming over here, they may have followed the men, but once they were here, they established their authority very quickly. And the women played a very important part in the direction that the family took relative to the education of the youth. Now, as far as myself personally is concerned, I grew up as a strong believer in the democratic principles. And that's one reason I became an outspoken socialist in my philosophy, believing that you must learn to respect the rights of individuals without subverting the democratic principles. And as such, I would go to extremes, if you wish, towards seeing that these rights are protected. And I believe that the rights of all individuals should be respected regardless of what their thinking or their philosophy is.
Currently, you are involved with the Canadian Macedonian Place Historical Society. Would you like to tell us a little bit about your role in the society?
Well, the Historical Society started primarily out of need, a very strong need. It's taken me something like 30 odd years to realize just exactly what was or what is our history and our historical background. And in the process of learning this, I began to realize that a lot of our history was not only distorted and twisted, but there was much of it that we ourselves did not understand. The important thing here was that I wasn't the only one that was actually feeling that there was something sadly lacking as far as the Macedonians were concerned. There was a very large segment of the Macedonian community that was not a part of the Macedonian church, that was not a part of the old Macedonian Bulgarian church, that was not a part of the Ontario place, and yet these people still identified as Macedonians. So the moment we said, let's get together and have a historic society whose primary purpose and primary function will be to get authentic material, just exactly who we are and why we're here, where we came from, and everything relative to the Macedonian community. All of a sudden, we found out that there was hundreds, if not thousands, of Macedonians that say, yes, I want to be a part of that. So all of a sudden, out of the woodwork, and I don't mean this in a negative sense, we were getting teachers, doctors, lawyers, engineers who didn't associate with the community coming to us and saying, we want to become a part of that historic society. We want to learn more about the Macedonian history. And many of the questions that came up relative to our language, relative to our religion, relative to our background, relative to our identity. All of these questions started to come into focus. And now for the first time, I honestly believe for the first time in the entire Macedonian community, world community, we've been able to put a perspective that no one else has been able to relative to what Macedonian history is all about. And we find that a lot of the things that we were hearing from the Greeks, from the Bulgarians, from the Serbians and others were distortions, not only out and out distortions, but they were half-truths that were twisted out of time to suit themselves. And now we're able to put them in a perspective that makes a lot more sense. And people want to learn more about it. So that now, all of a sudden, we are getting people that even identify as Greek Macedonians saying, yes, we are Greek Macedonians, but only out of necessity Greek, but really Macedonians in our heart.
Can you talk about your experience with the CMP?
Canadian Macedonian Place started roughly 12 years ago. And in the beginning, the whole concept of the Canadian Macedonian Place started with a man like John Bitoff. And it had a strong connotation at that time of being something that was being influenced by St. Kittle Methodi, and the impression that we got, many of our people got, was that it was being influenced by the MPO, and it didn't get the support initially until John was wise enough to say, hey, if we want this thing to work, we had to get the entire community involved. So what he did is he asked people from all segments of the Macedonian community, say, we have a necessity for a senior citizens home. Once he did that, the interest that was generated was large enough so that it became a reality. And how I got involved in it was probably as a result of my activity with the Macedonian community. And this is the way CMP works, whereas in effect what they do is they find prominent members among the in the Macedonian community, and they are invited to become members to CMP, and from this membership they elect a board of directors. And I was very pleased that I was one of the people chosen.
While growing up, did you speak Macedonian at home?
The answer is no.
No. What?
Well, let me finish now. When I say no, and this became a real handicap as I started to get more and more involved with the Macedonian community. My parents spoke Macedonian, and we would answer in English. And we had a very odd situation, and later on I found out I wasn't the only one that way, but there were many Macedonians where in effect we could understand what they were saying, but we couldn't answer them back in the language that they were talking. So that someone that would speak to me in Macedonian, I would answer in English, and if they didn't understand English, I was in trouble.
What type of programs were available within the community for language maintenance, Macedonian language, teaching of Macedonian language?
Prior to the Macedonian Orthodox Church, or St. Clement's, I don't think there was any to speak of. And I may be corrected whether there was any at St. Kirill Methodi. And if there was any language courses that were being given at Kirill Methodi, the chances are that the courses that were being given there were heavily influenced with the Bulgarian and Bulgarian dialect, and the inferences would have been that Macedonian was Bulgarian.
Can you explain the importance of community publications, specifically Macedonian publications?
Community publications of not just newspapers, but we're talking about the TV programs and radio programs become vital. But they're more vital if they are honest and sincere in presenting the news and not one-sided as to one particular segment or political viewpoint. We have been very fortunate to some degree that our newspapers have tried very hard, with a great deal of difficulty, and they've been able to achieve a certain amount of that. To some degree, we've also been able to get that from our television programs and our radio programs. So we've been very fortunate that way.
As a Macedonian born in America, now living in Canada, what motivates you to take such a prominent role in the Macedonian community?
As an individual, I've been interested not just in the Macedonian community, but in the community as a whole, as a Canadian, as an American. And I feel very strongly that the role that each individual plays relative to their own community adds to the integrity and to the unity that is necessary for creating a greater society. And as Canadians, it is important that we learn not to subvert any one nationality nor any one individual, but to learn to take pride in one's identity and to take that pride and instill it in the whole that becomes our Canadian community. the danger that seems to exist in the world, that existed in the Second World War, and that exists today, even today, is of the extremists. And the extremists are the ones that say, I am better than you. And as long as we have that philosophy existing, we're always going to have fear, and that fear is something that I don't want to pass on to my children, my grandchildren. I would like to see them develop the philosophy that we have here into something much greater. And that would be a country where people learn to respect one another for what they are and not for what one has or what one would like to be.
Thank you very much, Peter.